$700 a month would be more than enough for someone like you, don't you think? Victoria Hamilton's voice cut through the air of the five-star restaurant like a sharp blade wrapped in silk. I was sitting at the main table at Le Bernardin in Manhattan, watching my daughter Emma nervously squeeze her boyfriend's hand. Across the table, his parents were scrutinizing me as if I were a defective part that needed to be fixed. The offer of financial assistance had just come out of Victoria's perfectly painted lips, while her husband Robert nodded with that condescending smile I knew all too well. My name is Michael Thompson. I am 56 years old, and for the past 25 years, I have worked as the executive vice president of Atlantic Industries, one of the largest civil engineering companies on the East Coast. But they didn't know that. To the Hamiltons, I was just a single father from Queens who lived in a modest apartment and drove a 2012 Honda Civic. A simple man who clearly needed their generosity to survive. Emma had specifically asked me not to overdo it on my first meeting with her boyfriend's family. Dad, you know how it is. They come from old money. Just be yourself, no frills. Be myself. That's exactly what I was doing. That's very generous of you, I replied calmly, cutting my salmon without haste. But tell me, how much did you spend on James's graduation party? Victoria blinked, surprised by the question. Well, it was a special celebration. About 40,000, but... 40,000. I repeated the number as if savoring a rare wine. Interesting. Robert leaned forward, his chest puffed out with paternal pride. James graduated from Harvard, you understand. Some occasions deserve investment. I nodded slowly, watching Emma avoid my gaze. James looked uncomfortable, fiddling with his napkin as if he wanted to disappear under the table. Harvard is really impressive, I agreed. It must be comforting to know that the investment paid off. Victoria smiled, thinking that I was finally showing the proper deference. Oh yes. Education is everything, don't you agree? That's why we care about Emma. Such a talented young woman deserves every opportunity. The implication was clear, opportunities that someone like me could never offer. I completely agree, I said, taking a sip of the $300 wine Robert had insisted on ordering. Emma has always had access to the best opportunities. Well, now she does, Victoria corrected delicately. James can open so many doors for her. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Emma was red with embarrassment, James looked like he wanted to hide, and the Hamiltons watched me with that mixture of pity and superiority I had seen so many times before. They had no idea that I had designed 3 of the skyscrapers we could see from the restaurant window. They didn't know that my signature was on the construction contracts for half of Manhattan's commercial buildings. And they definitely didn't know that my annual salary was greater than the net worth of many families considered wealthy. But for now, I was just the simple father from Queens who needed their charity. By the way, Robert said, taking a business card out of his pocket, I know some contractors who are always in need of manual laborers. If you'd like, I can make some calls. Manual labor. I had supervised the construction of the new JFK Airport terminal. How kind, I replied, putting the card away without looking at it. It's always good to have options. Victoria clapped her hands softly, as if she had solved all my problems. Perfect. We'll take care of everything. Emma dear, you can rest assured knowing that your father is being well cared for. That was when I made my decision. They wanted to see a simple man. They were going to see how simple he could be. If you're enjoying discovering how arrogance can backfire on the most unexpected people, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because what they didn't know was that I had spent decades learning that true power doesn't come from how much you flaunt, but from how much you choose to hide. And I was about to teach them a lesson about underestimating people that they would never forget. The conversation continued over dessert, every word from the Hamiltons revealing exactly the kind of people I was dealing with. Victoria Hamilton was a 62-year-old woman who had inherited the family fortune at 25 and spent the next 4 decades turning money into social status. She spoke about her charitable works in the same tone she would use to describe a particularly well-trained pet. We support 3 needy families through our foundation, she said, delicately cutting her crème brûlée. It's so rewarding to see how small gestures can change entire lives. Robert, on the other hand, was a man who had built his entire identity around being perceived as successful. Every story he told included precise figures, every opinion he expressed was carefully calibrated to impress. Our financial advisor just recommended a low-risk investment that should yield at least 8% a year, he announced, as if sharing state secrets. Of course, you probably don't have enough capital for that kind of opportunity, Michael, but there are other options. Other options. As if I were a lost cause who needed basic financial guidance. Emma remained silent, her eyes fixed on her plate. James occasionally tried to change the subject, but his parents always steered the conversation back to my supposed precarious financial situation. The truth is, Victoria said, leaning forward slightly with that forced maternal concern expression, we are genuinely worried about Emma. It's not healthy for a young woman to worry about her father's financial well-being. Especially when she's at such an important stage in her career, Robert added. James can open so many doors for her. Connections that would take decades to build on her own. The implication was crystal clear. Emma was missing out on opportunities because she had a father who couldn't contribute financially to her social advancement. That's when Victoria pulled a small envelope from her purse. Actually, she said, placing it on the table beside me, we've prepared something for you. Inside was a check for $700 made out to me. The first payment, she explained with a beaming smile. So you can start getting yourself better organized. We consider this an investment in the happiness of our future daughter-in-law. I stared at the check for a long moment. $700. On a typical afternoon at work, I approved contracts that moved more money than they would see in an entire year. But to them, it was a generous amount being offered to a desperate man. That's very generous, I managed to say, tucking the check into my shirt pocket. Emma finally looked up, and I saw tears forming. Not from gratitude, but from humiliation. She was ashamed of me. Dad, you don't have to, she began, but I cut her off with a calm look. Your concern is touching, I said to the Hamiltons. You barely know me, and you're already willing to help. It's what we do for family, Robert replied, tapping the table lightly as if he had just solved all the world's problems. James looked increasingly uncomfortable. Perhaps we should ask for the check, he suggested timidly. Nonsense, Victoria exclaimed. The night is still young. Michael, tell us about your work. Emma mentioned that you work in an office. I work in construction, I replied simply. Ah, manual labor. Robert exclaimed as if he had just solved a riddle. That explains everything. It must be difficult to compete with younger labor these days. Younger labor. The man who had overseen the construction of some of the most complex projects on the East Coast was being categorized as an aging laborer struggling to remain relevant. Experience has its value, I replied calmly. Of course, Victoria agreed condescendingly. But let's be practical. At 56, you must be thinking about retirement. Or at least something less physically demanding. Physically demanding. They really believed I spent my days carrying bricks and operating heavy machinery. Actually, Robert said, perking up as if he just had a brilliant idea, I know some guys who do property security. Night work, good pay for someone with your life experience. Night work as a security guard. For the man who had designed the security systems for half the commercial buildings in Manhattan. It was at that moment that I realized it wasn't just about money or social status. It was about power. The Hamiltons needed to believe they were superior to me in order to keep their own self-image intact. They weren't trying to help a man in need. They were buying the right to feel important. Emma remained silent, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. Part of her was mortified by the situation. Another part was beginning to accept the Hamiltons' narrative about who I was. You know what impresses me most about you? I asked, taking another sip of the expensive wine. What? Victoria asked, clearly expecting a compliment. The ease with which you turn generosity into control. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This one had sharp edges. I don't understand, Robert said, his voice losing some of its friendly tone. Of course you do, I replied softly. You're not offering help. You're buying a position. James swallowed hard. Emma looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Michael, Victoria said, her voice still sweet but with a note of warning, I'm not sure you fully understand our situation. I believe I understand perfectly. Robert leaned forward. Perhaps you should consider carefully before biting the hand that reaches out to help you. Bite the hand. The mask was starting to slip. It's exactly that kind of language that makes me question your motives, I replied, keeping my voice level. That's when Victoria showed her true colors. Michael, you need to understand one thing. Emma is special. She deserves the best. If you truly care about her, you won't let your pride get in the way of the opportunities we can offer. Opportunities that could be taken away if I didn't behave like the grateful beneficiary they expected me to be. The emotional blackmail was complete. Accept our charity and stay in your place, or jeopardize your daughter's future. I looked at Emma, who was still avoiding my gaze, and made my final decision. They wanted to play a power game? I had spent 25 years playing these games at levels they didn't even know existed. But unlike them, I didn't need to buy my seat at the table. I already had it. The tension at the table at Le Bernardin became palpable after my remark about buying positions. Victoria and Robert exchanged a quick glance, the kind couples develop after decades of practicing manipulation as a team. Michael, Victoria said, her voice taking on a forced maternal tone. I understand that it can be difficult to accept help. Male pride is a complicated thing. Male pride. As if my reluctance to accept charity were some primitive character flaw. But let's be practical, Robert added, resting his elbows on the table as if he were about to explain basic math to a child. Emma is at a crucial age. 26 is when the foundations for the future are laid. And James can offer those foundations, Victoria continued, her hand lightly touching her son's arm. Connections in the financial world, opportunities at prestigious companies, a social network that would take years to build independently. Emma finally spoke, her voice almost a whisper. Dad, maybe we should just. Just what? I asked calmly. She hesitated, glancing nervously at James before continuing. Maybe we should just be grateful for their offer. They're only trying to help. Grateful. My own daughter was asking me to be grateful for crumbs offered by people who saw me as a charity project. It was at that moment that Robert decided to escalate the situation. Actually, he said, pulling his phone out of his pocket, I have the contact information for a friend who runs a subsidized housing program. Decent apartments for people your age with limited income. He placed his phone on the table, showing a contact saved as Tony Affordable Housing. Tony has been able to place several people we know in safe and clean places. Nothing luxurious, of course, but adequate for their needs. Affordable housing. For the man who owned 3 properties in Manhattan and a summer home in the Hamptons. Victoria clapped her hands softly, as if she had just solved all the city's social problems. Perfect. Let's make a call right now. Tony is wonderful with special cases. Special cases. I had become a special case. Emma was red with embarrassment, but she wasn't protesting. James looked like he wanted to dissolve into his chair, but he also remained silent. You know, Victoria said, her voice taking on a tone of inspiration, this could be the beginning of something wonderful. Michael, you could become an example for other men in your situation. What situation would that be? I asked. Older men who have lost relevance in the modern job market, Robert explained with the patience of someone talking to a person with comprehension difficulties. The transition can be difficult, but with the right support. I had lost relevance. The man who had revolutionized sustainable construction techniques and overseen projects that would redefine the New York skyline for the next 50 years had lost relevance. Dad, Emma said softly, don't you think it would be nice not to have to worry so much about money? The betrayal in her voice was more painful than all the Hamiltons' condescension combined. My own daughter was publicly suggesting that I was a financial burden on her life. Emma has always been very sensitive about her finances, Victoria explained to me, as if Emma weren't present. Daughters of fathers, in difficulty, tend to develop financial anxiety. Daughters of fathers in difficulty. As if my financial situation were a contagious medical condition that had infected my daughter. Robert leaned forward, assuming the tone of a businessman solving a complex problem. Michael, I'll be blunt with you. Emma deserves stability. She shouldn't have to spend the best years of her life worrying about whether her father will be able to pay the rent. Or whether she'll have to support him in his old age, Victoria added with brutal honesty. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma was studying her hands as if they held the secrets of the universe. James finally found the courage to speak. Maybe we should change the subject, he suggested timidly. Nonsense, his mother replied. These conversations are necessary. Michael needs to understand the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation. As if I were a child who needed to have life explained to me by responsible adults. That's when Robert pulled a corporate credit card out of his pocket. "You know what we're going to do," he announced. "We're going to start right away. Michael, I want you to go to the mall tomorrow and buy clothes that are appropriate for job interviews. Put everything on this card." He slid the card across the table to me. A $5,000 limit should be more than enough for a basic wardrobe. $5,000. For appropriate clothes for job interviews that they assumed I would need. "And then," Victoria continued enthusiastically, "we can work on your resume. I have a friend who specializes in career repositioning for cases like yours." Cases like mine. The language had become completely dehumanized. Emma looked up for the first time in several minutes. "Dad, I think they're trying to be kind." Kind. My daughter was interpreting systematic humiliation as kindness. "Actually," Robert said, pulling out his notepad, "I'll make a list of contacts that might be useful. They're not glamorous positions, mind you, but they're honest." He began writing, muttering as he made notes. Night security, janitorial, maybe something in gardening. Night security, janitorial, gardening. For the man who had designed security systems for federal buildings, overseen the maintenance of billion-dollar residential complexes, and developed sustainable urban landscaping projects for 3 states. "Michael, you're being very quiet," Victoria observed. "I hope you're not feeling overwhelmed by all this generosity." Generosity. The word sounded like a slap in the face. It was at that very moment that I made my final decision. Did they want to see a broken, grateful man? That's exactly what they were going to get. But what they didn't know was that I had spent 25 years learning that true construction happens after you completely destroy the inadequate foundations. And the foundations of their arrogance were about to be tested by an earthquake they would never see coming. Because while they were having fun constructing their narrative about my insignificance, I was mentally cataloging every word, every gesture, every revelation about their true characters. The man they were humiliating did not exist. But the man who sat silently at that table, observing, taking notes, planning? That man was about to teach them the difference between appearance and reality. And the lesson would be unforgettable. In the week following the dinner at Le Bernardin, the Hamiltons wasted no time in implementing their charity project. Victoria called me daily with updates on my supposed needs. "Michael dear," her voice sounded over the phone with that artificial sweetness I had learned to recognize. "I spoke to Tony about the subsidized apartment. He has a unit available in Queens that would be perfect for you." I was in my office on the 42nd floor of Atlantic Industries, watching the city stretch endlessly through the floor-to-ceiling windows. On my desk, $200 million contracts awaited my approval. "That's very kind of you, Victoria," I replied, keeping my voice appropriately humble. "And Robert has scheduled 3 interviews for you this week," she continued enthusiastically. "One for a night watchman, another for a gardener, and a third for, well, it's a cleaning job, but the pay is decent." Night watchman. For the man who had designed the security systems for half the buildings I could see from my window. "You really have thought of everything," I managed to reply. "It's what we do for family," she said, and I could hear the smug smile in her voice. "By the way, James mentioned that Emma is much more relaxed now that she knows you're being properly cared for." Properly cared for. As if I were an elderly pet who had finally found a responsible home. That's when Robert picked up the phone. "Michael, my friend, I have some excellent news. My accountant has suggested that you qualify for several tax deductions because you are, well, because of your current situation." My current situation. Their language became more dehumanized with each conversation. "He can help you maximize your income tax refund," Robert continued. "Of course, there is a service fee, but we can cover that for you." They wanted to manage my taxes. The man who had structured tax deals for government infrastructure projects was being offered help filling out a basic form. "Robert," I said calmly, "can I ask you something?" Sure. "What exactly do you guys get out of helping someone like me?" There was a long pause. Then Robert laughed, that forced way rich men use when they want to sound magnanimous. "Michael, we gain nothing. Just the satisfaction of making a difference. That's how people like us were raised." People like us. The arrogance in his voice was so thick I could practically touch it. I see, I replied. And Emma? How is she coping with all this reorganization? Oh, she's thriving. Victoria picked up the phone again. Now that she doesn't have to constantly worry about her financial difficulties, she's much more present at our social events. Their social events. As if my daughter had finally been accepted into an exclusive club. Actually, Victoria continued, clearly excited, we're planning a small charity event next Friday. Nothing too elaborate, just a few influential families gathered for a good cause. What kind of event? Fundraising for families in need. People who, well, people in your situation. It would be wonderful if you could come. Going to the charity event itself as an object of charity. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. Emma said you'd love it, Victoria added. A chance to meet other people who have received our help. You could form a little support community. A support community. For other Hamilton charity projects. Where will it be held? I asked. At our house in Southampton. Oh, Michael, you'll love it. We have a magnificent view of the ocean. Of course, it's a modest property by our standards, only 8,000 square feet. 8,000 square feet. Modest. Robert can send a car to pick you up, she offered. We don't want you to worry about transportation. It was at that moment that I made my final decision about how and when to reveal exactly who they were trying to help. Actually, I said calmly, I think I can arrange my own transportation. Oh, don't be proud, Victoria laughed. There's nothing wrong with accepting help. After I hung up, I sat in silence for several minutes, watching the movement of the city below. People walking with purpose, building their lives, creating real value in the world. Then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in months. Patricia? It's Michael Thompson. Yes, Michael from Atlantic. Listen, I need a specific favor for Friday night. Patricia Chun had been my personal assistant for 15 years and was one of the most organized people I knew. If anyone could coordinate what I had in mind, it was her. I need you to put together a short presentation, I explained. Nothing too elaborate. Just a few slides about our latest projects. And Patricia? I need you to come with me. May I ask the context? She inquired with her characteristic efficiency. Let's just say I need to correct some misperceptions. Over the next few days, the Hamiltons stepped up their charitable efforts. Emma called me on Tuesday, her voice tinged with gratitude and embarrassment. Dad, James's parents got you that apartment. It's small, but clean and safe. Emma, I said softly, how do you feel about all this? I feel relieved, she admitted. I know it sounds terrible, but I was really worried about how you would, with your age and everything. My own daughter had begun to believe their narrative about my incapacity. And are you happy with James? Very, she replied quickly. He's wonderful, Dad. And his family, they really care. They want the best for everyone. If these stories of transformation and turnaround are touching your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel to follow more moments where truth triumphs over arrogance. On Thursday, Victoria called with detailed instructions for the party. The dress code is casual elegant, she explained. Nothing too fancy, you understand. We want our special guests to feel comfortable. Special guests. As if they were rare specimens being put on display for entertainment. Oh, and Michael, she added as if she had just remembered something trivial, we've planned a little presentation during dinner. A few words about the work we do with families in need. Maybe you could say a few words about how our help made a difference. She wanted me to give a thank you speech. In front of an audience of wealthy people, testifying about how the Hamiltons charity had saved my life. It would be an honor, I replied calmly. Perfect. Robert is so excited. He loves it when our projects become success stories. Projects. Success stories. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and began preparing my own presentation. It wouldn't be exactly what the Hamiltons expected, but it would definitely be a success story. Friday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze from the ocean. At 5 in the afternoon, Patricia and I were in my private garage, where I kept my 3 cars. Which one, Mr. Thompson? She asked, looking at the BMW, the Mercedes, and the Aston Martin? None, I replied, pointing to the corner where my 2012 Honda Civic was parked. Today, we're going to keep it consistent. But in the trunk of the Honda, carefully packed, was a portable projector and a folder containing documents that would completely change the dynamics of the evening. As we drove toward Southampton, Patricia reviewed the final details. The presentation is loaded and tested, she confirmed. The contracts are organized chronologically, and I brought copies of the major projects from the last 5 years. What about the press releases? All here. Including last month's Forbes article about you being the invisible architect of Manhattan. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Invisible architect. If only they knew how literal that description would become tonight. When we arrived at the Hamilton estate in Southampton, I was impressed in spite of myself. It was genuinely spectacular, a colonial-style mansion overlooking the ocean, meticulously manicured gardens, and a circular driveway that could accommodate at least 20 cars. Victoria greeted me at the front door, wearing a cocktail dress that probably cost more than the average person's annual salary. Michael. I'm so glad you made it, she said, hugging me as if I were a distant relative who had overcome a terminal illness. Emma appeared right behind her, radiant in a navy blue dress I had never seen before. James stood beside her, clearly uncomfortable but trying to maintain a polite smile. Dad, you look well, Emma said, giving me a quick hug. Patricia? Victoria asked, noticing my companion. My assistant, I explained simply. Oh, how lovely, Victoria smiled condescendingly. Of course she can stay. There's always room for one more. Patricia kept her professional expression neutral, but I could see the sparkle of amusement in her eyes. As we walked toward the main hall, I observed the other guests. About 40 people, all clearly from the Hamilton social circle. Expensive clothes, discreet but valuable jewelry, that casual confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. And in the corner of the room, a small group of 5 people who clearly did not belong to the same social circle. The Hamiltons' other charity projects. That's where Victoria was leading me. Michael, I want you to meet some wonderful people, she said cheerfully. Sarah here lost her job 6 months ago, and we're helping with rent. Tommy is recovering from a work injury, and Maria was recently widowed. She was introducing us as if we were animals in a social zoo. How nice to meet you, I said sincerely to the others. They seemed genuinely needy and grateful for the help they were receiving. What bothered me was not the charity itself, but the way it was being presented. Like theater. Like entertainment. Robert approached with 2 glasses of champagne. Michael. The man of the hour, he said jovially. Ready for your big night? More than ready, I replied, accepting the champagne. Excellent. We've planned your presentation for right after the main course. Just a few minutes about how our help changed your outlook on life. Our help changed my perspective. If only he knew. Actually, I said calmly, I brought a little visual presentation. I hope you don't mind. Of course not. Victoria exclaimed, clapping her hands. How organized. Robert, he brought slides. Slides. As if I were a child in elementary school doing a science project. Can Patricia set up the equipment during dinner? I asked. Absolutely, Robert agreed. Such dedication. You see, dear, he said to Victoria, it's exactly this attitude that separates the success stories from the others. Success stories. Others. As we headed to dinner, I knew that the next hour would be the last time the Hamiltons would feel superior to anyone else in that room. Because soon, they would discover that the man they had spent weeks condescending to was, in fact, the architect of half the world they inhabited. And that discovery would change everything. Dinner in the main hall of the Hamilton mansion was a carefully orchestrated display of casual wealth. Baccarat crystals reflected the light from century-old chandeliers, while uniformed waiters served dishes that cost more than the average person's monthly salary. I sat at the special projects table, watching Victoria circulate among the guests like a radiant hostess, occasionally pausing to share inspiring updates about her charity cases. Michael has been a true example of gratitude, she announced to a group of elegant couples. Sometimes people just need a little help to find their dignity again. Find my dignity. As if she had rescued me from a life of despair. Patricia was quietly setting up the portable projector in the corner of the room, testing connections and adjusting the screen that had been installed for the evening's inspiring presentation. Emma approached my table during the second course, her face a mixture of embarrassment and maternal concern. "Dad, are you sure about this presentation?" she whispered. "You don't have to feel obligated to speak publicly about our situation." Our situation. Even my own daughter had begun to accept the Hamiltons' narrative about our supposed financial precariousness. "I'm absolutely sure," I replied calmly. James appeared beside her, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Mr. Thompson, if you'd prefer, I can talk to my mother about canceling your part." "That won't be necessary," I said, watching Robert make his way to the small makeshift stage in the center of the room. "Friends." Robert called for attention, tapping lightly on a crystal glass. "The special moment of our evening has arrived. As you know, Victoria and I deeply believe in the transformative power of targeted generosity." Targeted generosity. As if charity were a strategic investment. "Tonight," Victoria joined him, "we are pleased to present one of our most successful cases. Michael Thompson, a man who is facing significant challenges, and how our assistance allowed him to regain his stability." Significant challenges. Regain my stability. "Michael will share with us how kindness can truly change lives," Robert announced, gesturing for me to approach the stage. As I walked toward the microphone, I observed the expressions on the guests' faces. Well-intentioned pity, casual curiosity, and that subtle satisfaction wealthy people feel when they witness their own magnanimity in action. "Good evening," I began, my voice echoing calmly through the quiet hall. "My name is Michael Thompson, and I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to be here tonight." Victoria smiled radiantly, clearly anticipating an uplifting speech about how the Hamiltons' charity had saved my life. "Before I begin," I continued, "I'd like my assistant, Patricia, to help us with a little visual presentation I've prepared." Patricia nodded discreetly, and the first image appeared on the screen behind me. It was an aerial photograph of the Manhattan skyline. "This is a familiar sight to most of you," I said, pointing to the image. "But I'd like to draw your attention to a few specific buildings." A red dot appeared, highlighting an imposing skyscraper in the center of the image. "This is Freedom Tower Plaza," I explained calmly. "A 42-story office complex completed in 2019. Total construction cost, $230 million. Low murmurs began to circulate around the room. This was not the kind of presentation they had expected. The project was overseen entirely by me, Michael Thompson, in my position as Executive Vice President of Operations at Atlantic Industries. The silence that followed was so deep that I could hear the sound of waves breaking on the beach through the open windows. Victoria blinked several times, as if trying to process words that didn't make sense in the sequence in which they were spoken. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice slightly trembling, "but I don't think I understand correctly." "Patricia, next slide, please." The image changed to show the new terminal at JFK Airport, with a clearly visible sign crediting Thompson and Associates Engineering. "JFK International Terminal, South Gate," I continued, my voice maintaining the same polite and calm tone. "A $150 million renovation and expansion project. Again, supervised entirely by me." Robert had visibly paled. "Michael, I don't understand." "Of course you don't," I replied gently. "Because you spent 3 weeks carefully cataloging all your assumptions about who I was, without ever asking a single question about who I really am." Emma was standing now, her hands covering her mouth in shock. "Patricia, the financial report, please." The screen now showed an official Forbes document, with my photograph clearly visible next to the title, "The 50 Most Influential Executives on the East Coast." "My base annual salary at Atlantic Industries," I said, allowing the number on the screen to speak for itself, "is $670,000. That's not including performance bonuses, which last year totaled another $400,000. Victoria had sat down heavily in a nearby chair, her hand pressed against her chest as if she were having difficulty breathing. "So when you offered $700 a month to help me," I continued, my voice taking on a note of genuine amusement, "you were essentially offering less than I spend on a single business meal." But, Robert stammered, "you drive a Honda Civic. You live in a modest apartment." "I drive a Honda Civic because it's reliable and efficient. I live in a modest apartment because I prefer to invest my money in meaningful experiences and causes rather than impressing strangers with material possessions. Patricia moved to the next slide, showing a photo of the Atlantic Industries facade with my name listed on the executive board. You saw a middle-aged man driving a modest car and wearing simple clothes, and immediately assumed I was broke and desperate, she said, watching mortified expressions spread across the room. It never occurred to you that someone might choose simplicity over ostentation. Emma slowly approached the stage, tears streaming down her face. Dad, why didn't you say anything? Because I wanted to see, I replied honestly, who you really were when you thought you were dealing with someone you considered inferior. That's when Victoria finally found her voice, though it trembled visibly. Michael, we just thought we were helping. You thought you were buying the right to feel superior, I corrected gently. And it worked, didn't it? For 3 weeks, you felt generous, important, needed. You got to look down on someone and offer crumbs from your table. Robert attempted one last defensive maneuver. Well, technically, our intentions were good. Technically, I replied, your intentions were to feed your own egos at the expense of someone else's dignity. The difference is that the person in question happened to have sufficient resources to expose your hypocrisy. Patricia showed the final slide, a photograph of the major projects I had overseen in the last 5 years, including hospitals, schools, and actual low-income housing. For your information, I said, I regularly donate to actual charities. Not the ones that use other people's need as entertainment for social dinners, but organizations that work quietly to create systemic change. Victoria was crying now, tears smudging her carefully applied makeup. As for your job offers, I continued, night security work for the man who designed security systems for federal buildings. Gardening for the person who developed sustainable urban landscaping projects for 3 states. The irony is almost artistic. The silence in the room was absolute. 40 people who had come to witness a charity spectacle now found themselves face to face with their own limitations of perception. James finally spoke, his voice almost a whisper. Mr. Thompson. I'm sorry. You did nothing, James, I replied calmly. Except allow your parents to define your judgment of me based on superficial appearances. Emma came up on stage and hugged me, her shoulders shaking. Dad, I'm sorry. I should have known. I should have trusted. You should have, I agreed softly, but you've also learned a valuable lesson about making assumptions based on appearances. I turned to Victoria and Robert, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last 15 minutes. By the way, I said, pulling the $700 check from my shirt pocket, I'm returning this. I have a better suggestion for the money. I tore the check into small pieces, letting the fragments fall to the stage floor. Use it to fund a course on humility. You clearly need it. In the months following that night in Southampton, the Hamiltons' lives changed dramatically. Robert lost 3 major clients after the story spread through Manhattan social circles. Victoria canceled all charity events, unable to face the whispers and judgmental looks. Emma visited me a week later, still processing everything she had discovered. Dad, why did you never tell me about your work? She asked, sitting in my office, looking at the projects scattered across the walls. Because I wanted you to love me for the man I am, not for the money I make, I replied. And I wanted you to learn to judge people by their character, not their bank account. James ended the relationship 2 days later. Not out of anger, but out of shame. He realized he had spent 3 years dating a woman who allowed her family to humiliate his own father. The real transformation happened when Emma started volunteering on actual housing projects. Not social events disguised as charity, but genuine work with families in need. I learned that simplicity doesn't mean poverty, she told me months later. And that ostentation rarely means substance. As for the Hamiltons, I heard they moved to Florida. Victoria still organizes small events, but never again with the same arrogance. The most powerful lesson I learned? True wealth isn't in what you own, but in who you choose to be when no one is watching. If these stories about dignity, character, and the importance of not judging by appearances touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more moments where truth triumphs over superficiality. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how big your bank account is. What matters is the size of your character.